They told you Ludwig II was mad, that he built castles for fairy tales, that he drowned in a lake because his mind snapped. They lied. This isn't a story about insanity, it's a story about power, about control, about what happens when a king decides to live on his own terms. In 1881, one photograph shattered everything. A common actor sits, a king stands, not just a scandal, a confession, in plain sight. It triggered a conspiracy, and it ended in murder. This king reversed time itself, slept by day, lived by night, built a kingdom underground, lit by electricity, ruled by secrecy, guarded by silence. But secrets leak. Servants whispered, ministers panicked, documents vanished, and one man, a psychiatrist who never met the king, declared him insane. 2 days later, the king was dead, drowning. The water was waist deep, his lungs were dry. The witness paid for silence. What was Ludwig really hiding? Why did they want him erased? Why are some files still classified 138 years later? Because this wasn't about madness. It was about freedom, and freedom terrifies power. In 1881, a photograph was taken that should have been destroyed immediately. A young Hungarian actor sits in an ornate chair while the King of Bavaria, one of Europe's most powerful monarchs, stands beside him like a servant. In royal protocol, this was beyond scandalous. It was impossible. A king never stands while a commoner sits. The only reason this photograph could exist is if that commoner was something more than anyone was supposed to know. When copies reached Munich, ministers who saw it understood immediately what it revealed. That this wasn't just a breach of protocol. After 2 decades of carefully orchestrated deception, the king's most dangerous secret was suddenly visible to anyone with eyes to see. And that single photograph would set in motion a conspiracy that would end with 2 bodies floating in a lake. A fisherman paid for his silence, and a mystery that Germany still keeps classified documents about to this day. You know Ludwig II as the Mad King who built Disney's castle, that fairy tale fortress called Neuschwanstein, perched on a Bavarian cliff. 6 million tourists visit it every year. But what they don't tell you on those tours is that every tower, every secret passage, every hidden room was designed for one purpose: to hide what was happening when the king reversed his entire life, sleeping all day and living only in darkness. Because Ludwig II had discovered something that would have destroyed him if it came to light. In darkness, he could finally love who he truly loved. This is the story of how one forbidden photograph exposed a shadow kingdom built on secrets, where a king who couldn't love women created an elaborate nighttime world where he could be himself, where cutting-edge electric technology lit underground grotto for midnight trysts, where servants were paid fortunes to forget what they saw, and where eventually the wrong people discovered what was happening in that darkness and decided the king had to die. June 13th, 1886, Lake Starnberg, Bavaria, 10:30 p.m. 2 bodies float in waist-deep water. One is Dr. Bernhard von Gudden, Bavaria's most respected psychiatrist, his face bearing scratches, his neck showing signs of strangulation. The other is Ludwig II, King of Bavaria, age 40. His watch stopped at 6:54 p.m. The official report will say suicide by drowning. But Ludwig was an excellent swimmer. No water was found in his lungs, and the fisherman who discovered the bodies. He received mysterious payments for the rest of his life, and somehow became mayor of his small town. But to understand why a king ended up dead in a lake, why a doctor was strangled, why a fisherman was paid for silence, we need to go back to when this beautiful, damned prince first discovered the terrible truth about himself. Munich, 1863. Ludwig is 18 years old, and he's just met the man who will destroy everything. Prince Paul Font, on taxis, walked into Ludwig's life, wearing the uniform of an aide de camp. All golden buttons and perfect posture. Ludwig had seen beautiful men before. The Bavarian court was full of them. But Paul was different. When their eyes met across the throne room, something electric passed between them. Something that in 1863 Bavaria didn't have a name for, or rather, it had too many names, all of them dangerous. Within weeks, they were inseparable. Paul would arrive at Ludwig's chambers late at night after the rest of the court had retired. Their official correspondence was proper, formal, but hidden in the royal archives were other letters. Letters that survived only because someone forgot to burn them. Dear and beloved Ludwig, Paul wrote in one that survived. My heart beats only for you. When I see light in your window at the residence, I know you're thinking of me. I am consecrated to you, body and soul. Ludwig wrote back, with the kind of passion that would later be used as evidence of his insanity. You're the sun in my darkness. When you're away, I cannot eat, cannot sleep. I pace my chambers like a caged animal until you return. But courts have eyes everywhere. Servants whisper. Ministers take notes. Within 6 months, rumors were spreading through Munich's beer halls. The uncrowned prince, they whispered, preferred the company of his aide to camp to any of the suitable princesses paraded before him. Something had to be done. Ludwig's mother, Queen Marie, was the first to act. She summoned Paul to a private audience. No record exists of what was said, but Paul left Bavaria that very night, transferred to a posting in Prussia. He would never return. Ludwig's first taste of heartbreak came with a lesson. Love for him would always mean loss. But there was something else that happened in those months after Paul's departure. Something that would define the rest of Ludwig's life. He began to change his schedule slowly at first, missing morning meetings, arriving late to afternoon councils. By winter, courtiers noticed the prince was rarely seen before sunset. His Highness, one minister wrote, seems to have developed an aversion to daylight itself. They thought it was grief. They were partially right. But Ludwig had discovered something during those late-night meetings with Paul. In darkness, in those hours when proper society slept, he could be himself. The mask he wore during daylight hours, the perfect prince, the future king, the man who would marry and produce heirs, that mask could come off when the sun went down. Then, in 1864, everything changed. King Maximilian II died suddenly, and at just 18 years old, Ludwig became King of Bavaria. The crown weighed 3.5 pounds, but for Ludwig, it might as well have weighed 1,000. Because now, he wasn't just expected to hide who he was was expected to marry, to produce heirs, to secure the Fiddleback dynasty. The very survival of the 700-year-old Bavarian monarchy rested on his ability to do the one thing he could never do, love a woman. They tried, of course. In 1867, the court celebrated when Ludwig announced his engagement to Princess Sophie, sister of the famous Empress Elizabeth of Austria. Sophie was beautiful, intelligent, everything a queen should be. The wedding was planned for August 25th, Ludwig's birthday. Invitations were sent across Europe. But as the date approached, Ludwig grew increasingly erratic. He postponed once, then again. Finally, in October, he called Sophie to a private meeting. I cannot do this to you, he told her. according to her later memoirs. You deserve a husband who can love you completely. I am not that man. I will never be that man. The engagement was broken. Sophie remarkably seemed to understand. She never married anyone else, later saying, "How could I after being loved by Ludwig?" But she was wrong about one thing. Ludwig hadn't loved her. He was already in love with someone else. Richard Hornig entered Ludwig's life through the stable doors, literally. He was a groom responsible for the royal horses when Ludwig first noticed him in 1866. Blonde, blue-eyed, with a kind of classical features that seemed carved from marble. Hornig was everything Paul had been, but with one crucial difference. He was low-born enough that no one would suspect. Or so Ludwig thought. Within a year, Hornig had been promoted from groom to master of the horse, then to personal equerry. Ludwig gifted him property by the lake, a fortune in annual salary, and something even more precious, unlimited access to the king's private chambers. In his diary, discovered only after his death, Ludwig called Hornig de Galipa Minosilla, the beloved of my soul. But these same diary entries revealed the terrible war raging inside the king. On one page, he'd write passionate declarations of love. On the next, prayers for forgiveness, self-flagellation for his sins, promises to God that he would resist temptation. I am damned, he wrote in 1869. But damnation with him is sweeter than salvation alone. It was around this time that Ludwig made a decision that would baffle historians for decades. He would build a castle, not just any castle, a medieval fantasy perched on an impossible cliff, accessible only by a bridge that could be destroyed in case of attack. He called it Neuschwanstein, the new Swanstone. But here's what those historians missed. Every single room in Neuschwanstein was designed for privacy. Secret passages connected bedchambers. Hidden doors allowed servants to come and go unseen. The throne room, magnificently decorated with Byzantine mosaics of angels and kings, had one telling detail. The throne itself was never installed, because Ludwig never intended to hold court there. Neuschwanstein wasn't built for royal business. It was built for royal secrets. And it was there in 1869 that Ludwig's transformation into the Night King truly began. The change was so gradual that at first no one noticed. Ludwig would schedule meetings for late afternoon, then early evening. By 1870, most court business was conducted after 8 p.m. By 1875, the transformation was complete. Ludwig II of Bavaria had reversed his entire life. He woke at 7 p.m., had breakfast at midnight, lunch at 3 a.m., and dinner at sunrise before going to bed. But why? Historians have called it madness, eccentricity, a sign of his deteriorating mental state. They were wrong, because what was happening in those nighttime hours was something no historian of the 19th century would dare to write about. Ludwig had created a shadow kingdom, a parallel Bavaria that existed only in darkness, populated by those who, like him, couldn't exist in the harsh light of day. The cast of this shadow kingdom was carefully chosen. There was Hornig, of course, now practically living in the king's chambers. But there were others, young actors from Munich's theaters, recruited after midnight performances. Musicians who played private concerts in the Venus Grotto, that artificial cave Ludwig built at Lindhof Palace, complete with an underground lake illuminated by electric lights that could change color. Red for passion, blue for melancholy, green for jealousy. Oh, that Venus Grotto. Let me tell you what really happened there, because the tourist guides won't. Built between 1876 and 1877, The Venus Grotto was sold to the public as Ludwig's tribute to Wagner's opera Tannhäuser, where the hero visits the goddess Venus in her underground realm. But the grotto served a different purpose entirely. It was a completely controlled environment where Ludwig could orchestrate elaborate scenarios that would have been impossible anywhere else. Picture this: an artificial cave 90 meters long with a lake heated to precisely 28 degrees Celsius. Mechanical wave machines created gentle swells. Hidden musicians played Wagner from behind artificial rocks. And in the center, a golden boat shaped like a shell, where Ludwig would float for hours with his chosen companion of the evening. The electric lighting system was revolutionary. Germany's first power station, built specifically for one man's pleasure. But those lights did more than illuminate. They transformed. Under red light, the grotto became the Venusberg, the mountain of central pleasure from Wagner's opera. Under blue, it was the Blue Grotto of Capri, where Roman emperors once held their own secret gatherings. But most importantly, those lights could be extinguished completely at a moment's notice, plunging the grotto into absolute darkness if unexpected visitors arrived. The servants who worked these night shifts were chosen carefully and paid extraordinarily well. But even generous salaries couldn't always buy silence. By 1880, disturbing reports were reaching Ludwig's ministers. The king, they heard, was requiring young male servants to perform dances, private dances, without their uniforms. One report, filed by a dismissed valet seeking revenge, described scenes that would later be used as evidence of Ludwig's insanity. His Majesty commands performances that would shame a Roman emperor. Young men chosen for their beauty must dance before him, wearing only garlands of flowers. He watches from his throne, eyes gleaming in the candle light, occasionally calling one forward to whisper private instructions. These reports might have remained buried in ministerial files if not for what happened in 1881. The event that would begin Ludwig's downfall, the arrival of Isef Quintes. Keynes was 23 years old when Ludwig first saw him perform at the Munich Court Theatre. He was playing Deer in Victor Hugo's Mariandelum, and by all accounts, his performance was competent but not extraordinary. Yet something about him captivated the king. That very night, Ludwig sent a royal summons. Most actors would have been terrified. A private audience, with the increasingly reclusive king, known for his strange behaviors and stranger requests. But Kind was different. Ambitious, certainly, but also curious about this mysterious monarch who lived in darkness. Their first meeting lasted until dawn. What they discussed, no one knows. But within a week, Ludwig had invited Kinesis on a journey to Switzerland. Not as an actor, not as entertainment, as a companion. The Swiss trip of May 1881 was supposed to be secret. Ludwig travelled under the alias Count von Berg, Kind as his secretary. But Ludwig, in his infatuation, made a fatal error. He allowed a photographer in Lucerne to take their portrait. That photograph. God, that photograph. In it, Kind sits in an ornate chair, relaxed, almost casual, his hand resting on his knee. Ludwig stands beside him, the King of Bavaria, standing while a common actor sits. But it's their expressions that tell the real story. Sinus looks directly at the camera with a slight smile, confident, knowing. Ludwig gazes not at the camera, but at Keynes and the look on his face. It's the look of a man completely, helplessly in love. When copies of the photograph reached Munich, Ludwig's ministers were horrified, not just because of the breach of protocol, but because of what it revealed. The king's sexuality, carefully hidden for nearly 2 decades, was suddenly visible for anyone with eyes to see. Count Maximilian von Holstein, Ludwig's former friend turned political enemy, saw an opportunity. He began collecting evidence, not just the photograph, but testimonies from dismissed servants, receipts for lavish gifts to male companions, and most damning of all, excerpts from Ludwig's own diary stolen by a bribed valet. But Holstein knew that homosexuality alone wouldn't be enough to dethrone a king. This was Bavaria after all, where such things were quietly tolerated among the nobility as long as they remained discreet. No, he needed something more. He needed to prove Ludwig was insane. Enter Dr. Bernhard von Gudden, Bavaria's most prominent psychiatrist and a man with his own ambitions. Gudden had never met Ludwig, never examined him, never even been in the same room as him. But that didn't stop him from producing a detailed medical report. The report, compiled in March 1886, is a masterpiece of medical malpractice. Every eccentricity becomes a symptom. The reversed sleep schedule, clear signs of dementia, the private theatrical performances, delusions of grandeur, the relationships with men, contrary sexual instincts indicating moral insanity. But here's what that report really said. If you read between the lines, Ludwig II wasn't insane. He was inconvenient. By 1886, Ludwig's debts had reached 14 million marks. His castles were bleeding the royal treasury dry. But more dangerously, his increasingly open relationships with men were becoming impossible to hide. The shadow kingdom he'd built in darkness was being dragged into the light. The conspiracy moved quickly. On June 10th, 1886, Ludwig was declared insane and unfit to rule. His uncle, Prince Ludwig, was named regent. A commission was sent to Neuschwanstein to arrest the king. Ludwig got word of the coup just hours before they arrived. His loyal servants, the ones who'd kept his secrets for decades, warned him he had a chance to flee. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, his cousin, and perhaps the only person who truly understood him, had arranged for carriages at the border. But Ludwig hesitated. Where would a deposed king go? He asked his valet. What life exists for a Ludwig who is no longer king of Bavaria? When the commission arrived at Neuschwanstein at 4 a.m. on June 12th, they found Ludwig in his bedroom, fully dressed, as if he'd been waiting for them. Dr. von Gudden, leading the commission, finally came face to face with the man he declared insane without ever meeting. How can you declare me insane? Ludwig asked him. You have never examined me. Gudden's response was chilling in its certainty. It was unnecessary. The documentary evidence is overwhelming. They took Ludwig to Berg Castle on Lake Starnberg, supposedly for treatment, but everyone knew the truth. This wasn't a hospital. It was a prison, and Ludwig would never leave it alive. On the evening of June 13th, less than 48 hours after his arrest, Ludwig asked Dr. von Gudden to walk with him by the lake. It had been raining, but the storm was passing. Gudden, perhaps feeling guilty, perhaps simply overconfident, agreed. He even dismissed the guards who usually accompanied them. The king is calm, he told them. We need no protection from a broken man. They left at 6:30 p.m. By 8 p.m., when they hadn't returned, search parties were sent out. What they found has never been adequately explained. Both bodies were in the water, about 25 meters from shore. The water was waist deep. Ludwig's watch had stopped at 6:54, Gudden's at 8:10. The doctor's face bore scratches, nail marks. His neck showed signs of strangulation. The official verdict came within hours. Murder-suicide. Ludwig had drowned Gudden, then himself. Case closed. but nothing about the scene made sense. Ludwig was a strong swimmer. Multiple witnesses confirmed this. The water was shallow. He was found floating face down, but no water was in his lungs. His coat, which disappeared immediately after the autopsy and has never been found, allegedly had 2 bullet holes in the back, according to Countess Josephine von Verbitz, who claimed to have seen it before it vanished. And then there was Jacob Leidl, the fisherman who found the bodies. Within a month, Little had received enough money to buy property. Within a year, he was mayor of his town. He never spoke publicly about that night, but in his private papers, discovered only after his death. He wrote something chilling. The king was escaping. I had a boat ready. As he waded toward me, I heard the shot. He fell forward into the water. I was told if I valued my family's lives. I saw nothing but 2 drowned men. Who fired that shot? Who gave Lele those orders? Who paid for his silence? We'll never know for certain. Some documents related to Ludwig's death remain classified by the Bavarian government to this day. In 2007, when researchers petitioned to open them, they were told the files were too sensitive for public consumption. But perhaps the greatest mystery isn't how Ludwig died, but why he had to die at all. He was already deposed, already declared insane. Why kill a powerless madman unless he wasn't powerless? Unless he knew secrets about other members of the nobility. Secrets gathered during 2 decades of midnight gatherings and shadow kingdoms. Unless his very existence, even in captivity, was a threat to men who'd shared his darkness, but not his courage to live in it. The aftermath of Ludwig's death was swift and thorough. His private papers were seized, and most were burned. The servants who'd attended his nighttime gatherings were dismissed with generous pensions and strict confidentiality agreements. The Venus Grotto was sealed for renovations that lasted years. Richard Hornig, the beloved of my soul, disappeared from court immediately. He lived another 30 years in obscurity, never speaking publicly about his relationship with the king. Isef Kines returned to the theatre, becoming one of Germany's most celebrated actors, but he never performed in Bavaria again. When asked about Ludwig in a 1910 interview, shortly before his own death, he said only, "The king was the loneliest man I ever met. He built castles in the air because the real world had no place for him." But here's the extraordinary thing. Those castles Ludwig built, those fantasies made stone, they survived. Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, Heronium. The Bavarian government, the same government that declared him insane, quickly realized these castles were gold mines. Within a few years of Ludwig's death, they were open to tourists. Today, Neuschwanstein alone generates over 50 million euros annually for Bavaria. The castles Ludwig built in his desperate attempt to create a world where he could be himself have paid for themselves hundreds of times over. The Mad King's folly became Bavaria's greatest treasure. And perhaps that's the cruelest irony of all. Ludwig II, who spent his life hiding in darkness, has become one of history's most visible kings. Millions of people every year walk through his castles, photograph his grotto, buy postcards of his fairy tale towers. They see everything except what was really there. A man so desperate to love and be loved that he reversed time itself, turned night into day, built impossible dreams in stone and steel. The water of Lake Starnberg keeps its secrets, but sometimes on foggy nights, locals say you can still see lights on the water where the king died. Not electric lights or torches, but something softer like moonlight where no moon shines. They say it's Ludwig still trying to reach that boat, still trying to escape to a world where kings can love whom they choose, where night can be day, where fairy tales can be real. The mad king is dead. Long live the dream king. Today generates over 50 million annually for Bavaria. The mad king's folly became Bavaria's greatest treasure. Every Instagram photo, every Disney castle, every tourist ticket is a monument to a man who was destroyed for being himself. In 1886, just days after Ludwig's death, Empress Elizabeth of Austria wrote in her diary, "They killed him not because he was insane, but because he was free. And freedom, true freedom, is the one thing power can never tolerate." Ludwig II died at age 40, having spent less than 200 nights in the castles that bankrupted him. But in those stolen hours, between sunset and dawn, in a kingdom that existed only in darkness, he lived more truthfully than most kings ever dare. The water of Lake Starnberg keeps its secrets. The German government still classifies documents about that night, but 138 years later, we're still walking through his dreams, still trying to understand the king who loved in darkness and died in the light.